Economy and politics have been a big part of anthropology, I think, since the get-go. And one of the reasons, like kinship, it's easy to see economics in the sense that you can see stuff moving back and forth. Most societies have a fairly complex pattern of this, remember back in gift giving, in terms of when you give someone to something, what the social process by which that happens is. So it was something that anthropologists could observe, even if they couldn't talk to the people very well. They could see stuff moving around, the rituals attached to it. So economics in one way, shape, or form was useful. I think it also had an advantage for anthropologists. It's easy to measure, or at least they thought it was, because they thought they could see it, which made it easier than kinship. You know, you could watch. I mean, you can go to society you know nothing about. We could dump you off in Shanghai, for example, and you know nothing about Chinese society. You could still see stuff moving around to get some idea of what's going on by virtue of how people react to it. You might be wrong, but at least you'd be seeing something. So in that context, I think that's important to remember when you're looking at political systems. It was within that, or I should say economies, it was in the idea that initially for anthropologists who largely were studying cultures other than their own, it was one of the easier sort of low-hanging fruit to at least get some grasp of what this group was up to. And also frequently was a very easy way to get into discussions with people. You know, they might not be willing to talk about their religion or maybe even aspects of their kinship, but they almost always would be able to talk about, well, you know, or willing to talk about, well, why did you give this, or why did you do this when you accepted that? You know, because it's the same thing that kids would ask. So economy and to a certain extent, we'll see politics has always been sort of front and center in a lot of the way anthropologists see their world around them. In terms of the way they interpret, I should say, the world of the group they're studying. So if you look at the definition of economics, you know, the one I've got here is actually the one that's sort of pulled out of the text. Easiest way to think of economics is you've got needs that people want to fulfill, and there's some other person that has the ability to fulfill those needs. So if you want to think about it, traditionally economics can be seen in its simplest form as the movement of goods and resources from the folks that have it to the folks that need it. And in a more complicated way, that can include almost anything, especially in today's world. It can include, you know, you go back to Second Life, for example, it can include something that's digital that doesn't exist, like an outfit that you get from one of those little adult little girls that was selling kids outfits. So economics becomes really complicated when you look at it in terms of its variations. But the reality of it is there has to be an assumption of need on one hand, and there has to be the ability to fulfill the need on the other hand. Economics is not the pattern of desires, it's the fulfillment of things. Some of which are necessities, many of which, especially in today's world, are things that we want, but actually aren't really necessities at all. You know, given that it's showing up fairly soon, the iPhone 12 at almost $1,000 is hard to argue it's a necessity, but there's no doubt they're going to sell a lot of them. So economics oftentimes appears incredibly complex, but the reality is actually pretty simple. Probably more sort of scary about all this is actually a concept that starts up in Europe in the Renaissance period, but it gains traction in the 1700s and becomes a key part of the principle of the United States. In fact, more so than Canada. It's one of the areas where the Americans are very different than Canadians. And this, I think, has to do with the fact that the United States sort of set itself up, even as a colonial period, as an area where you went to do more than you could do back home. You could build a new life for yourself. It's not by accident that Australians have very much the same view. And if you think about this, you've got the same logic process for the settlement of Australia. So what you get is the folks coming to the United States buy into a particular ethos. And this, by the time we become a country, this becomes a standardized part of the ethos to the extent that it's in both the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And this is basically that you should always be able to acquire more or have more, regardless of what that is, over time. We call this economic growth model. So, for example, in your guys' case, whatever you're since you're students, you're making nothing. But essentially, we'll say you're working part-time, so you've got survival wages. And the attitude is when you graduate from Chaminade, you'll make more. But the attitude is also 10 years after you graduate from Chaminade, you'll be making more than that, 20 years more than that. So the idea that over time that you have economic growth, both individually in terms of people, but also collectively. That a society has more, that a society makes more, is part of the Euro-American concept of what we call an economic growth model. Now, there's nothing wrong with a growth model. Most societies have that in some way, shape, or form. But what's really sort of terrifying about the United States is that becomes normative. So it becomes expected. So in almost any situation, you can certainly see this during the COVID discussions now with economic impacts. People don't talk about, economists and people that talk about this in the sort of political sense, are already talking about how, Hawaii is going to take, 7 to 8 years to go back to what it was. And then there's an assumption that you're going to go up to there and then you're going to keep on going beyond that. So there's an attitude that growth, in the sense that both collectively, but also individually, people over time should acquire more, should have the potential to have more. And that's actually what's normal. It's very much a Euro-American mindset, and I would say specifically American and Australian more than anyone else's mindset, that you don't see in most of the societies. Asian societies don't have the economic growth model as norm. Chinese society, despite the fact that they're now the world's largest economy, they don't have that model. Chinese don't grow up, nor does even the government have the idea that things are always going to grow. They're trying to sort of ride a wave, basically, and get it while it can. But they don't see that as the way the world's built. Now, if you exist in a society which sees this as the way the world should be, then you end up in sort of a scary situation, because it means even if you do fairly well, but you stay in the same spot, that's sort of seen as failure. That's like running down an up escalator. If this growth model is an escalator, which means there's always supposed to be more, then if you're staying in one place, you're actually having to work to do that. And you, of course, see this a huge amount in American society, with the attitude towards folks that don't get promoted or don't get pay raises or something like that, that somehow that's a failure. I should point out, in most societies, that's not the way it's seen. Even in most European societies, they wouldn't even grasp that concept. So this is very much an American thing. And the reason that's important is what it means is when Americans, and this would include American anthropologists, frequently in the past and even sometimes today, look at other societies, they look at them as if they should have this as their model. In other words, they don't see this as a normative model just for Americans. They see this as a global model that's representative of, say, the human species. So there's always this idea that people should be dissatisfied with what is and should always want more. And this oftentimes is parlayed into discussions that historians have about, motives for change. Is there always this sort of innate desire to grow, to have more? I should point out there's very little evidence for that. It's a very convenient way to interpret history, but it doesn't really work very well. And actually, ironically, anthropology is a very good example when you look at other societies, of the fact that very few other societies have this as a concept. So one of the ironies is that anthropologists are probably one of the better groups at disproving the idea that the validity of an economic growth model is norm. But it's not like anyone listens to what anthropologists say anyway, so what the hell. So just sort of keep that in mind. It's oftentimes the way that especially Americans judge others, and they stereotype them. So for example, American stereotypes of Hawaiian society by the late 19th century include the fact that Hawaiians weren't very ambitious, because they were comfortable with that, and didn't see any particular need to do more. And to especially the Calvinist Puritans that were coming over here and become the missionary boys, their view of the world is you always had to strive for more. So that becomes a way to basically stereotype Hawaiians, is that they're not ambitious. And of course, what you then do is you then segue that and you say, well, Hawaiians are lazy. Not because they're not working hard, but because they're not ambitious, in the sense they don't constantly have this demand to want more that makes them somehow less than. So this is a hugely important way that especially Americans judge other cultures and that other societies and other value sets, even in American society. Okay, key part that I wanted to go over is production and labor. Karl Marx and Engels, two German social historians, but also economic historians in the sort of first half of the 19th century. What their big interest is again this idea of what motivates change, what makes societies change. Why did what they're actually looking at is, why do societies become more complicated? And they both meant economically, but also politically. Why do you go from heads of families to having chiefs and then kings, for example? Why is that persistent in a number of different places? So they were sort of what you might call the big view type of historians. which was real popular back then in the 19th century. And so one of the things that they very got interested in is the fact that the period of time they were living in, that they were trying to write this stuff, was the 1830s and 1840s, which, you have to go bother Mitch or one of the other historians around here and find out some details in that. But in Europe especially, that was a period of intense turmoil. And so it's worth spending just a second on this, because it's important to remember that we always look at things from within the context of the world we live in. So Marx and Engels had been born and, were kids when Napoleon was around. And so Europe was in this basically, European-wide war. And there's a lot of turmoil. There's the French Revolution, and then, they're getting rid of kings. And then Napoleon gets wiped, and everything goes back to normal. So all the kings pop back up again, and all the countries go back to normal. They all celebrate that they beat Napoleon, and France is now just another country, and this is the way it should be. And that lasted for about, maybe 20 years. But then all of a sudden, by the late 1830s, 1840s, what you get is all these various social movements occurring within countries. In England, it was heavily tied to the Luddite movement, which is absolutely fascinating if you want to go Google that. Very interesting movement of basically large numbers of unemployed rural folks and city folks who didn't want to engage in the Industrial Revolution because they saw it as stealing their jobs, which it was. And so they basically started destroying factories and became very sort of anti-tech, sort of an early version of a retro movement, I guess, which spread throughout a lot of Europe also. But what you find in a lot of the rest of the Europe is all of a sudden people look around and they decide that they don't understand why they have a king. They don't understand that system, and they want something that's different. And the weird thing about this is it's not like there was some movement spreading through Europe, like one guy with a new message. It was all these places sort of popping up at the same time in the 1830s, 1840s, and Europe just goes through massive amounts of dislocation. Large numbers of bankruptcies, economic collapses, new societies starting up. Belgium forms, so countries start up, kings get wiped out. And almost always this is within a country. So it's not like someone invading their neighbor. It's countries in themselves start self-examining and being very unhappy with what they have. And so in this period, this is when Marx and Engels are trying to write this stuff about history. So on one hand, they're looking at the past. On the other hand, they literally walk out into the street and read the newspapers and see what's happening in their world that they're actually living in the 1830s, 40s, and they can't make any sense of it. It makes no sense to them. And ironically, if they're supposed to be talking about being able to predict change, it's sort of embarrassing when you say, oh, we can predict change, and they can't figure out what the hell's going on in their own front yard. They decided when they were looking at all this, and I think it was partially driven because a lot of these movements were based on labor, in the sense that people had been dispossessed from their jobs, or they'd been thrown off of their farms. And so a lot of this had to do with people being very vocal and in some cases physically reactive to the fact that suddenly their world had changed on them. And so Marx and Engels started to, I guess, think that at least in the readings, if you read their stuff, which is pretty hard to read a lot of it, they actually come up with the idea that this is one of the key factors behind the way that people interact. And especially when you're looking at the structure both of economies in the sense of things moving around, but also politics, that they thought that the key factor had something to do with what they were literally seeing in front of their front door every day, with the strikes and the protests and the riots and everything going on. And so they basically came up with this concept, which is really useful and it still works very effectively today. In fact, maybe even better today than it did back then, of two sort of defining concepts that are related to each other. One is the concept of production, and the other is the concept of labor. So first off, you got to remember that we're not talking about sort of a generic American English word labor. We're talking about a very specific technical term, which is still pretty much in common use in the behavioral sciences, and certainly in things like economics and business and such. So let's take a look at how this plays out. Okay, I'm going to show you this, but I'm not sure if it's going to make a lot of sense. Okay, this is a piece of coral. It's from a house site on Molokai. We acquired this about, I don't know, 30-something years ago. It was actually in a road next to a house site, so it was out of context. Someone had either kicked it or moved it over there, so there was no way you could tie it back to what was going on around it. So if we look at this from Marx's concepts, he had two basic concepts. One is the concept of production, and he defined that as the process by which something moves from its original raw form to its final used form. So here we have a piece of coral. This is branch coral. This is at Kamaloke Avanui, or Molokai. And down on the shore down there, what you have is large numbers of fairly large branch corals. And this is pretty obviously originally a piece of branch coral that, stuck out like this, and someone broke it off or was broken off naturally. And they picked it up and what they did. So that's the start. The production start was actually a piece of coral on a reef. Now someone took this piece of coral and they actually modified it. They shaped it and basically turned it into a fairly smooth surface. And they were using this as a sanding stone. You use this to make adzes and probably also to work wood. So it's like a file or sandpaper would be today. It's a very convenient size. It's a very good size, especially if you're doing fish hooks, which it makes really good. It's really good for working with fish hooks. So it's a polishing stone or a sanding stone. So this thing has been shaped by somebody. Now, this is a fairly simple form of production because you've got the original piece of coral. You just modified it a little bit. You whacked off all the sharp edges. You sort of, basically rubbed it down with something really hard to make it the shape you wanted, and then pretty much you just used it. So there's not a lot of conversion from the original raw form of coral to the final used form of a tool. This works a lot better for in a classroom, by the way. Here's another example of this is actually found nearby. This is an almost finished adze. And there's no particular reason why it would have been, but it's very possible. This stone, for example, is what you do to put a polish on this surface. If you notice, this one surface here is beautifully polished. This again was found in a bulldozed road, so unfortunately it wasn't in context anymore. But this again was originally a piece of dark, what we call dark bluestone. It's a very dense form of basalt that you find here. This isn't found on Molokai. There's one spot on Molokai, but it's a different color. This is very likely from Halakala on Maui, where you find the nearest, nice quarry of this stuff. And so what you had is in this situation, you had, this bluestone occurs in big blobs like this. So someone saw this and then, whacked it into a smaller piece that they could carry around. And somehow it got carried over to Molokai. And there someone actually whacked it with a set of stones to make it in the shape they wanted. This is basically like a chisel. So then they roughly shaped it, and then they went and they started polishing it to make the final form with the smooth edges. And if this was ever finished, it would have been smooth on every side. And this would have been a much sharper surface, and you'd use it like this. You use it to basically carve wood. So on one hand, these two are sort of related. This would be used, for example, to modify this. So this has a more complex production history. You have the original piece of rock on one island. The rock is taken to another island. It's shaped in various places. Someone acquires, and then someone does a lot of shaping to it. So the production cycle was a lot more complicated between an original piece of lava, or basalt sitting on the ground somewhere, and a final worked tool that someone's using to carve maybe a canoe or something like that on another island. So you can see that production here gets a little more complicated. But it's still pretty straightforward because you can basically go walk to Maui and you can find the quarry where this came from. And if you go to the house site near here, you can actually see little bits that were probably pieces off of other adzes like this where the guy had whacked them. Somebody that made a fair amount of these it looked like. So this is fairly straightforward. Let's take something a little more complicated. Okay. Something you should be intimately familiar with in 2020. A face mask. Now, this has two parts to it. One is the material that the mask is made out of. This is actually something synthetic. We'll just make it simple. We'll say this is cotton. And then you've got these elastic bungee things, which I'm pretty sure have to be some sort of plastic material because they're elastic. So in that situation, think about this for a second. On one hand, it's a very simple object. Okay, it's just a piece of cloth that's been sewn together in layers. And then it's got this elastic cord stitched into the corner. But if you actually think of the original form of this thing, this originally was plants somewhere with little white cotton balls on it. That's probably Ethiopia or India. Someone actually picked the cotton off of the plant. You have to actually comb, because there's a whole mess of processes you have to do with cotton. And eventually you turn it into thread. And then from that, you weave it into material. So this becomes a lot more complicated. To get this piece of cloth, you not only have the cotton that has to be converted into cloth, you also have the dyes, for example, because this whole thing has been dyed. So it's some very complex pattern dyes in here. This has to be some sort of a metallic substance or also plastic. It looks like a mylar of some sort. There's undoubtedly some sort of minerals that are used to make the dyes to make these colors. This particular piece here is plastics, and of course plastics come from hydrocarbons, if you want to think like oil. So this comes out of wells. So this comes from someplace like Saudi Arabia. This comes out of the ground. It goes through a very complex process at various factories to be turned into elastic cord. These are all then brought to a location where they're stitched together to make this mask. So unlike this, which is pretty straightforward, you can walk down from where this was found and probably figure out, roughly where it came from. You literally can see where it came from where you're standing holding it on Molokai. This, on the other hand, the parts of this part came from Saudi Arabia. This part will say came from India. But by the time it was turned into cloth, that was probably in some other country. And of course, I bought this in Hawaii, sold by a Japanese store, Don Quixote's. So who knows how the hell it ended up in Hawaii. And that doesn't include the dyes for the minerals. So notice how something as simple as a mask, which just on one hand is just a piece of cloth with some elastic, is actually a very complex production cycle, which says something about globalization in the 21st century. That people think nothing of paying. I think this is like $7. People think nothing of paying $7 for material that has gone probably 15, 20,000 miles for this, maybe another 10,000 miles for the elastic. And yet and then someone has to sew it and turn it into this, and you have to print the colors on all this and all the rest of that, and yet it still only costs $7 US. So this production cycle is incredibly complicated. It's actually global versus something that basically went maybe half a kilometer up a hill. Okay. This is where Marx's ideas are really handy. If you look at the idea of production, which would be the process of converting this from the original raw forms, so cotton, fluffies, tar, oil pumped out of a well. I have no idea we'll just say, coal. I can't imagine what the black is. I have no idea. Manganese, maybe. So you've got the colors coming from mines, and all of that eventually turns into a mask. Okay. Now there's another part of that. So production is the process by which you go from raw material to the final, final form, which is the mask that I have here in the office. Now, the other term that they came up with, which is really critical of this, is the concept of labor. And so what they said is there's another part of this, because not only is there the process of converting this from one thing to the other, to its raw form, to its final form, but you also have the labor involved. In other words, the energy it takes for that to happen. So if you think about it for a second, if I'm paying $7 for this in Don Quixote's, and they're going to turn a nice profit, so let's say they're getting 50% profit, so they only paid $3.50 for it. Think of how much someone in India is getting to handpick that cotton in the first place, or how little they're getting, I should say, how little they're getting reimbursed to pick that cotton. Think of how little someone's getting reimbursed to turn this into cloth. Think of how much someone's getting paid to stitch this into a mask shape. All of that is what we call labor. So labor is the actual energy it takes to do production. So they're two very related concepts. One is the thing itself going from its raw forms to its final consumed forms. The other is the labor that it takes to get it from the raw form to the final consumed form. And again, in the original form, if we go back to the sanding stone, polishing stone for Molokai, the labor costs are pretty straightforward. Someone walked down to the shore, picked up a piece of coral, bang, 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 shaped into things, polished it up a little bit, and then bang, it's done. So the labor costs are fairly straightforward and probably one person. If you think about it, in this case, on one hand, they made God knows how many thousands of these things, but there's an incredibly complicated labor process. It might be that part of this is even automated, very likely it was. So you've now got robots, but then someone had to make the robots. Someone has to program the robots. Someone has to ship this thing. Someone has to ship the cotton from India to wherever the factory is. Someone has to ship the cloth from the factory to wherever they make the mask. Someone has to ship the masks from wherever it's made to Don Quixote's to be sold. So the labor costs are really complicated for objects like this. And this becomes a central part of anthropology is understanding production. We now realize understanding production and understanding labor are really central to understanding a lot of aspects of what people do and how people see things in the world around them. Labor is an incredibly complicated concept when you start to think of this process of conversion. On one hand, it can be entirely pragmatic. You want a mask, this is a nice one, so it's going to cost you X. Same thing with this. You need a sanding stone, this is a nice way to do it, bang, you do it. On the other hand, for example, we'll say that your niece is 7 or 8 years old and they just started up school again. So she makes you, in one of her classes, she makes you a clay dog. And, the thing looks god awful. It looks like a blob with sort of an ear attached to it, you know, and then only a relative can love it. It's not the production that you value, it's the labor. It's the fact that she made it. The labor actually makes it of value, not the actual object itself. And this is the thing that, though Marx and Engels weren't looking at that, this is where anthropologists come in a big way, is the realization that different societies value the same object in different ways, depending on how they see production and labor and the relative, you know, proportion of each, or what they find is more useful or more important. So two hugely important concepts you got to get clear. The way I'd suggest is just actually look something sitting around while you're watching this video, and try to figure out what the actual production costs are. And sometimes it'll be pretty mind-blowing. You know, I have no idea. Think what the production cost would be for a cell phone. You know, you look at all the technology inside of it, the parts that make it up, the metals, the plastics, the glass. Glass comes from silicate, which is a particular type of sand, which has to be melted. This is high temperature or Gorilla Glass. So it's got some sort of additives to it, I think manganese. You've got the casing on this one, which is plastic, but some sort of high density plastic. You've got some sort of metal on the side. The original thing's is made of metal, of course. You've got all the computer parts inside with gold on it, for example, that comes out of mines. You start to look at this thing, it's almost like you can almost do like an entire dissertation on what is the actual raw materials that make up a smartphone. And then we don't think anything about it, we just buy them and use them. And that's true of much of our world. In fact, one of the arguments about a lot of the modern industrialized world is we've completely lost any sense of the production and labor cost attached to objects. We go in and we buy something and it never even dawns on us, or we don't even bother to think about the consequence of how that happened to be made, and what happened to the various people who were involved in that process. How much were they reimbursed? What did they get out of it, etc. So keep those in mind and then practice it. It's a real interesting way to sort of look at the world around you, and sort of can be pretty stunning when you think about it. Third of their concepts that came up is the idea of the dialectic. And I think this definitely comes from the period of time they were living in. They were living in a period of time that's very much like this year. They were living in a period of time where when you woke up in the morning, you weren't sure if the same government was going to be in place, no matter where you lived. You were pretty sure there was going to be conflict going on, but you could also be pretty sure the conflict wouldn't be the same this week as maybe what the people were upset about a month or two earlier. So they lived in a world of constant change. And it was constant change, but it really wasn't very predictable. But if you asked people, on the other hand, why were they upset and what changes did they want, they could pretty frequently give you a pretty good idea of what it was they didn't like and what they wanted it to turn into. So what Marx and Engels did is they came to the conclusion that all the folks prior to them that studied a lot of academic stuff were wrong. Because in the past, the key part of academics was that things normally stay the same unless they're pushed to become something different. You guys, if you think about your high school science classes, it'd be homeostasis. So the idea that what we call steady state, that things will, in a moment of inertia, will remain the same if they can, and change then is something that gets pushed onto things. But that things, including people and societies and groups, won't change if they don't have to. Marx and Engels said that's wrong. The world they were living in the 1830s, 1840s showed no examples of that. People weren't trying to say, you know, wait, let's not change. I want to stay the same way this week as last week. They were saying change, in some cases burn it up. And even the folks that wanted to go back didn't want to go back to the world of the year before. They wanted to go back to some period of time way back in the past. You can see this discussion right now between the vocal left and the vocal right in American sort of post-social political dialogues. Your really sort of vocal right population wants to go back to a period of time when things were, quote, better for that group. A lot of your vocal left movement, or more liberal movement, wants to change everything. So what you've got is both those groups aren't talking about staying the same as last week. They both want to go someplace different than where they are. They just can't agree on where that different place is. So this is the context that Marx and Engels were looking at. They were looking at a world in which change is constantly happening, but it's not always very predictable, and it doesn't follow real obvious A to B to C type logic rules. So what they came up with, the concept is the dialectic. This is sort of really hard to do without a graph. Hang on a second, let me pause this and I'll come back. Let me draw something up first. Oops. Okay, here's my superb piece of art. If I was going to be very sophisticated, I would have done this with one of my online art programs, but since I'm lazy, sorry, I didn't say it. Since I was challenged, this is what I came up with. So when you're looking at this, there's three parts to it. You have the idea of a thesis. This is what they basically are saying. So Marx and Engels argued that in any situation, what you've got is there's an original idea. So for example, the idea that people wanted to be able to communicate rather than yelling at each other. Well, that's, in part is defined by writing systems, but that also reads to the telegraph and eventually reads to the handheld phone, Bell's phone invention. So the idea that you could talk to people at a distance is the idea of thesis. Now, say it's the, I don't know, it's what, the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, before you guys were born, or when originally came up with cell phones, which were originally these big buggers, looked like a brick. Very quickly they got smaller. So the idea was, you went from idea of being able to talk to someone at a distance, say in a phone on a wall, or somebody like a pay phone, like in a phone booth back in the day. And people thought, well, that's all fine, but that's not actually good enough. What we really want is we want mobile communications that happen whenever we want. So they come up with the idea of a mobile phone, a way to communicate without having to go look for a phone, so you can carry it with you. So that's the idea, is mobile communications. That's the thesis. That's the idea. That's the intent. Now, what happens is when they come up with this idea, it makes perfect sense to them, and it is logical. But what you don't know is because you haven't been there before. You haven't had mobile communications. Whoa, how can I focus here? Since you never had mobile communications before, it's very difficult to understand what's going to be the consequences of this new technology, because you've never done it before. You can't predict something that's never existed in terms of what's going to do. So what you go is on one hand, you have the goal, and the intent and the goal is to allow people to talk to whoever they want to, whenever they want to, without needing to be in a particular place. In other words, they carry their communications with them. So in that context, what you do is you develop, like the old Motorola Razr way back in the day, a flip phone, we now think of them. And so what you've got is that ability to communicate, which is exactly what they're doing. This thing keeps on trying to change focus for. Okay. Now, the things that you don't know that are going to happen, that are going to be a consequence of this, are what we call the antithesis or antithesis. So in the antithesis, you can think of this would be things like, they didn't realize at the time, though of course we're now well aware of it, that if you can talk to anyone at any point in time, that means that people can bother you anytime. Whereas before, as long as you were away from a phone, you were in quiet. Now, if you're carrying your communications around with you, people can ring you up, 24/7 to go ask you some stupid question. Now, that has social consequences, because if you don't answer your phone and people know you have one with you, then people wonder what the hell the problem is. So it makes you, there's all sorts of social implications if you don't answer your phone. There's also then that changes the social behavior. You don't have to think about what you want to talk to someone about if you've got to go walk to a phone. If on the other hand, you've got a phone with you all the time, you can ask people stupid questions when you could use your brain instead, because it's easier to ask someone to think. It also changes the relationships if you're, for example, at a meeting, or you're meeting someone who's important to you and you're trying to have a serious sort of emotional discussion with them, and all of a sudden your phone rings. So, and this becomes, by the time cell phones and the idea of portable phones became common, 20, 30 years ago, this became standard part and parcel of all sorts of, aspects of both society and also commentaries about society, was the fact that cell phones weren't necessarily a good thing, because they meant that you were always in communication, which had never existed before and wasn't necessarily a good thing. But because that had never happened before, you couldn't figure out what were going to be the consequences till you try it. Okay. So one of the side effects of this is you could have gone with two ways. One, you could have just said no. Okay. But people didn't want that, because they actually wanted to be able to talk to whoever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to. So the initial idea was kept. What then happens is you start to develop more sophisticated versions of this. So if you think of this as a spiral down here, here's the original idea. You want to have 24/7 mobile communication. So you come up with the original cell phone. What you then do is you decide that if you're going to do communications, you should be able to do other stuff on this thing also. So you start to add other capabilities to that phone. Pretty soon, among those capabilities, you add the ability to do video and take pictures on that phone. And it actually becomes basically a small computer. Now, in all these cases, you've basically done this because what was most important to you was mobility. You wanted to be able to carry your world around with you rather than go someplace. So you want to be able to do your office work on your phone rather than having to go to your office to do the office work. And so in that situation, of course, you end up with this. Okay. Now, if you remember earlier in the semester, we've had a ton of discussions about this. Again, that instilized the social the media thing you guys just had just recently, most of you reacted to. This is a consequence of these thesis, the original thing you wanted to do, given Marx and Engels' way of looking at stuff, and also the unanticipated consequences of having this thing. There is absolutely no doubt that cell phones, but more importantly, social media using smartphones, is one of the major sources of stress and emotional stress for large parts of the world's population that are hooked up on smartphones. It's an enormous distractor for you guys as students. And especially in a COVID world, on one hand, it's a necessity because it's how we communicate. On the other hand, it's also the biggest, fastest way to bring people into tears. And if you're familiar with the Japanese cases, it's shown a pretty dramatic increase in suicides by virtue of social media, in large part, given the fact in Asia, this is what people use based on phones, because you can diss anyone on a phone, you can do anything on a phone. Think of your, the dating video, I'm just dropped, total mind blank on that. Social media on one hand didn't exist until you had mobile communications that were available 24/7. There were emails prior to that, back in the day when all people had PCs, but they didn't really become social media until you had this, and it also has the cameras on the back, the camera on the front. You can now take pictures of the world around you. And on one hand, it allows you to remain more engaged than you could before, and it's a lot more convenient. On the other hand, it's also an absolute nightmare. So what happened, and what Marx and Engels are pointing out, is you have the original idea, your original thesis, the original reason you wanted to, the original idea you wanted to do something. What you also have then over time is an increasingly large list of things this either does poorly or new problems that this has brought into that never existed before. And what Marx and Engels pointed out is eventually you're going to end up with this list here. The negatives are going to be actually as powerful as the positives for why you wanted to do it in the first place. And what they said will then happen is you'll end up with a synthesis. Is the population, one way, shape, or form, will decide that, okay, we've got to change the original thing to a new version that will actually address the problems that have shown up. Now, I have no idea what this is going to be, okay? But I can guarantee within 10 years, the only time you'll see these things is on sale on eBay as an example of old tech. In 10 years, you guys will not have smartphones. You'll have something else. And you have to remember that's because these things have only been around for 12 years. So these things will not exist in 10 years. The new devices that come up will be able to offer you new stuff. They'll offer you benefits. I would suspect, among other things, it'll probably be holographic, maybe in a version of a glasses, so you don't have to look away to use it. Very likely it'll be something that you can actually integrate in with your vision. Now what that means theoretically is it'll be even more convenient. You'll be able to theoretically drive while you're using this. You'll be able to have dinner with someone and actually deal your communications. Will the dinner be any better? Will you be a better driver? Very likely not. But it will address some of the issues, some of the antithesis or antithesis stuff that modern smartphones have. But because it's brand new, guess what? It might be on one hand a synthesis of that, but it will, because it's brand new, it will generate its own set of antithesis or antithesis. And this is what Marx and Engels are trying to get at. This is why they came up with sort of a, lack of a better term, this idea of a spiral. You want to be able to talk to, you want 24/7 communications with anyone, anywhere, anyway, anyhow. Okay. You have these various iterations over time, and you're trying to get here, but notice how it's not a straight line. You don't go from here to there. You go through all these variables that result because of the contradictions that are built into the new consequences of new technology. And so it becomes a very complex pattern. Of course, this could actually change, and all of a sudden now your goal becomes slightly different, and that makes this even more complex. This is one of the main aspects of the dialectic. The dialectic concept in anthropology, originally from their view of economic history, was that change is a constant. Change is not a predictable linear thing. It's a very complicated thing that goes around with an intent, a goal of intent, but no one knows how to get there because you haven't been there yet. So it's sort of a wandering path, but there's always an intent to get somewhere or somehow or somewhen. In that context, it is the only actual model we have in the Western intellectual tradition which sees change as a constant. Every other model we have assumes that change is a perturbation or something that disturbs the norm. So they see the norm as being like a flat pool of water or a bowl of water. And it's nice and smooth and it's quiet. That's the way things are supposed to be. And, you know, some Warner drops a rock in there and all of a sudden, boom, and there's a splash and it ripples up and down. And that's abnormal. But then as soon as it can, it will settle back down. That's the model that even in anthropology, many anthropologists use when they look at cultures. They look at cultures as being very quiet, very stable, very predictable until all of a sudden change happens and all of a sudden that predictability is thrown out and all this change happens, but everyone wants to go back to the normal. There's no evidence in anthropology that that's actually the case. There's no evidence that culture's going back, even when they try to go back to the past. It's a fictive past, as we'll see. It's not the reality of the world they lived in. It's the modern stereotype of what that world consisted of, what I'd call sort of a Disney view of the past, like in Moana, for example. So in that context, Marx and Engels' idea of the dialectic is really useful as a model because it assumes that change is actually a normal state of affairs. That doesn't mean that people like it, but it does assume that change is always going to be in play and that societies then have to address change or how they're going to deal with change because it's a constant situation. The type of change might vary from one month or one area to another, but the fact that change is going to happen is actually normative. And that makes it a very incredibly useful theory because there's nothing else like it. We don't have anything else in the Western tradition that uses change as a constant. So that's the dialectic. The dialectic is that idea of thesis, you know, an idea or goal of everyone. Antithesis in terms of the problems that show up once you've started trying to do this, resulting in some sort of a, you know, modified version which addresses most of the problems but still does what you wanted to do here, and that's the synthesis, which then of course then continues the same process at another level. A very, very useful model, especially for an anthropologist looking at societies. Okay. Last of their ideas was sort of interesting because anthropologists tend to do this a fair amount. Yeah, well, sort of maybe. And this is the idea of praxis. And the funny thing is Marx and Engels didn't do this. They were, you know, as per usual with intellectuals, they're very good at making pronouncements, but they had no intention of following themselves. But one of their arguments was that if you were going to make predictions about things, you know, if you're going to be, for example, an anthropologist or a historian or an economist, you actually had to practice or try what you preached. So they argued that if you're going to be studying, say, the social impacts of cell phones. I mean, what the hell, we've already seen a bunch of videos of that. Then one of the things you'd have to do if you're actually looking at that is you'd have to make predictive models about how these changes are going to occur, how people are going to deal with this. And you then actually have to try to implement those to see if you're you basically test your predictions. So in other words, you just don't write something up with, I think this is going to happen. That's like the last chapter in the book. They would argue what you then had to do is actually try to come up with some way to both test those predictions that you're making and also basically fix the problems that you saw that were going to make that an issue. This is called praxis. In other words, if you want to practice what you preach. Now, as I point out rather ironically, they never did that. As far as I know, neither of these guys ever, for example, started up a company or ran a store or anything like that. So, you know, they were sitting there writing this stuff and they didn't do anything that actually had to do with labor or production themselves, as far as I can tell. But nonetheless, it's again a very interesting concept that's become pretty much central in anthropology. Sometimes, at least in my personal view, anthropologists can go overboard and they become advocates rather than anthropologists, which are two very different things. In other cases, and I would put myself in this category, you use what you study to assist populations that are part of the group that you're studying with the endeavors that they have. So if you would, you become a information source or a skill set that they can use for whatever their agenda is. But again, it's the same type of thing that you actually have to practice what it is you study rather than just study in the abstract. So those are Marx's concepts. Sorry if it's been sort of long. I just can't think of an easy way to shorten this. do actually look around you. It's something really simple. And maybe something that's, for example, is so we'll say you have a head of lettuce, but the head of lettuce came from someplace like California. Think about it just for a second, what the production or labor process is of that head of lettuce that you pick up at a store. Okay, so on that gets us into enough complicated stuff. So we'll stop there.